everybody, and welcome to our expert roundtable today, where we are going to be talking the trials and tribulations of Office 365 tenant migration. And we have a cast of people here who are deep technical experts in the industry, and I could not be more happy to introduce them. Kicking things off, we have Tony Redmond, who is a Microsoft MVP with over 2 decades of experience in the Microsoft ecosystem. He is the lead author of Office 365 for IT pros and an icon in the Office 365 space, and we are very grateful that he can join us today and share his advice on the topic. We also have Gary Bent, who is the global infrastructure architect at Omnicom Group. Gary leads perhaps the most complicated tenant-to-tenant migration project on the planet right now, with an internal consolidation of 137 tenants to one. Gary is here today to share his firsthand experience from such an extreme project. Also joining the cast is Paul Robichaud. He is Quadratec's CTO. Paul is also a Microsoft MVP and owns the overall product development at Quadratec, and is also a co-author on Office 365 for IT pros. Paul's extensive Office 365 experience paired with his product work gives him a unique perspective in these difficult projects. And then finally, we have Mike Weaver, who is the Director of Enterprise Management at Quadratec, as well as the product owner of Quadratec's tenant-to-tenant migration product. Mike specializes in mergers, acquisitions, and divestitures. With both industry and product experience, he is here to help plan and execute these projects around the globe. And with that, I'm going to hand it on over to Mike.
Thank you, Brad. It's great to be here and talk about this topic today. It's been really well received, so we're really excited to have today's session. Today, this is it's going to be a very short agenda. We're just going to talk very briefly on Quadratec. You can set your watch. It'll be less than 90 seconds, just an overview of what we do, so if there's something that is of interest. But we're going to then hop right into it. Brad did the introductions of the expert panel today, which is a really good panel for this really difficult project set of tenant-to-tenant migrations. We're going to go into individual advice from each member of the panel, and then we've taken your questions, all those great questions that everyone submitted. We've themed some together because there were some common themes, but we also put the individual questions in there as well. We'll go ahead and hop in and debate those questions, and we'll hop right into it. If after the webinar, we will have the questions posted as well, so the answers will be out there as well in the next couple days. But very briefly on Quadratec, we have 3 main pieces of business that we do here at Quadratec. First is the modernized category, and that's bringing legacy systems into Office 365, or in some cases on-prem Exchange. So things like mailboxes, archive systems like Enterprise Vault, EMC Source 1, pesky PST files, and journals, archive journals from email systems. Today, a lot of what we're going to be talking about is powered by Quadratec Cloud Commander, which is our tenant-to-tenant migration product, and so some of that will come into here. And then Optimize. This is our Nova platform, and this is our platform that we use for really deep reporting and analytics and delegated administration and management for really large tenancies, or maybe not as large tenancies, but also multi-tenant management, a lot of what is a common theme today. So if any of that is of interest, get in touch with us today. But with that, Tony, can I introduce you, and can you share some of your wisdom in the tenant-to-tenant space? I think we have Tony on mute.
Yeah, you have Tony on mute. That's just showing that after so many decades of doing this stuff, I have absolutely no ability.
Fair enough. We hear you now. Yes, we can. Go ahead, Tony.
Yeah. So I'm not an icon. I don't know where Brad Sam's got that icon thing. That's just silly. But anyway, that's the way he wants to play it. My perspective on tenant-to-tenant migrations is that the first thing is that you should not expect to automate everything, and there's a very simple reason why. Is that technology will be able to take care of things like shuttling information around, but it won't be able to deal with all of the legal and HR and other issues that are involved in corporate mergers, splits, acquisitions, divestitures, restructuring, whatever you call it. My experience is that these projects tend to have a lot of technology involved, because clearly you've got to make systems available to people at the end of the day to help them working. But there's a hell of a lot of stuff in the background that is required up front to deal with the human aspect of it. So that's the first thing. In other words, don't look for a silver bullet. The second thing is a reflection that we're now about 9 years into the Office 365 journey, 9.5 years maybe. And one thing that's become very clear is that things are becoming an awful lot more interconnected and an awful lot more linked together than they ever were in the past. And the experience and tools and whatever that we've had for maybe moving on-premises data around really don't apply all that well in the cloud, simply because everything is very, very connected. Teams is the absolute example of a connected app. But one of the things I think that we've got to realize is there's a lot of data now that's hidden away from people, that's used for things like machine learning, artificial intelligence, stuff that's generated by the Microsoft 365 substrate that's just there. And it's the essential nerve elements, it's the nerve bundles, if you will, of Office 365 and Microsoft 365. So some consideration has to be given about how you are going to not just shuttle raw data around, but and that raw data is messages and documents or whatever, but how you're going to make sure that once you get data over to the target tenant, that the data is as usable as possible for the end users. So that's a big thing for mine. And the last thing I'd say is that tenant-to-tenant migration is complex. If anybody tells you it's not, they're probably basing that assessment on moving 5 mailboxes around and declaring success. It's the kind of stuff you see on demos in technology exhibitions at the large conferences that we used to go to. You'd walk up and say, show me your software, and they'd show you how they could move 5 mailboxes or 5 documents around. You say, ooh, that's good. The real world is not like that. The real world is full of complexities, subtleties, inconsistencies, and just bad data. So the most important thing is you should take away from this session is that you need to plan and test everything before you start moving any data. Okay, I get off the stage, nice and quick.
Thanks, Tony. And speaking of real world experience, Gary, can you give us some of your world experience from this really intense project that you've been leading?
Sure, Mike. Thank you. So we spent a few minutes talking about, my advice on tenant-to-tenant consolidation. As you heard earlier, we're doing 137 tenant-to-one consolidation within Omnicom. And what we found out for ourselves is really it takes discovery planning and the program pull it all together. And what do I mean by that is really doing what I call the first pass discovery, right? Really understanding what your environment looks like, and it's critical to understand that, because pitching that to management and getting the executive buying at the corporate level is super critical to make the project successful, right? Really laying out what the benefits and the ultimate strategy of the program and what we're doing with it. So that upfront discovery becomes super critical as part of that advice. And the next piece of this is really around, what we did is the mission statement. Trying to get a lot of, federated agencies, 137 different tenants into one, is really thinking about what is our mission statement and getting people aligned to the business and defining that goal. And really ensuring that, our executives at the very top are buying in, because if they don't buy in at the very top, how do you get, 1,500, 5,000 brand agencies across Omnicom to get on board? And it won't be easy trying to have everyone go through this activity in a real sense. Bringing in 137 tenants is not really what I call a migration. It's a transformational activity, right? How do you transform an organization into a different state, into one single tenancy? And all that comes together around planning, right? And planning becomes the piece of getting all of the details, what I call the second pass, the more detailed discovery around the tenancy, breaking that down into things like t-shirt sites, complexity levels, and really prioritizing that whole thing. I think this is critical, prioritizing the whole actual program around the business objectives and what the business is looking to do around tenant consolidation. And then I think, Tony said it very clearly, is really defining a whole bunch of things that make the program work, right? Defining your pipeline and migration factory, how that's going to work, right? How you're going to intake things as you go along. Testing, and more testing is super critical. There's a lot of moving parts to Office 365. And, the one thing I think we have found out as a part of this is it's never green. Microsoft is constantly changing the tenancy, their brand new features and functionality. those things will come as part of tenant consolidation. How do you deal with that, right? And it's really around testing and really around regression activities and how do you solve for that? And then really defining, two sets of categories around that planning is really how do you deal with things that are manual, right? Because some parts of the tenancy you just cannot migrate because it's manual. And then some parts of the tenancy are automated that you can actually put in a pipeline and it works. And then defining your tool sets. And when I say tool sets, there are lots of tools that can be needed to deal with the complexity of 137 tenants, different moving parts to get that all done. And then communications, change management, and support, right? And there's also data sovereignty in our world of being a multinational company, how to deal with that. So all of that coming together is what I say is this is not a project, it's a program, because you're trying to coordinate all of these components together to ensure that everyone is aligned and ensuring that the engine is running to get us to the end, right? And all of this is very complex. You really can't do it, what I call line by line. It's really a mini M&A activity every single weekend, trying to get that done, and tracking all the complexity, all the unknown issues are going to come up, and ensuring that all the activities and everything is on track, right, to make sure that you're meeting your objectives and can adjust where you need it. So with that said, don't want everybody to forget about all the other things around tenant consolidation that comes up that are mission critical. Things like identity, right? Identity is super critical to really understand, especially in our world of having 540 different ADs. How do you deal with identities? How do you normalize and rationalize that into one single entity for a person? DNS is critical. Without that, you can't do things like, MX records and moving all your text records across, right? Getting control of lots of DNS entries across the enterprise becomes mission critical to the success of the project. Understanding things like ADFS and third-party SAML integration become super critical. Azure resource, I think a lot of you forget about that, and how you deal with Azure, Visual Studio and DevOps, application registration, all the complexity of SharePoint, custom maps, and then Office 365 Dynamics, right? So these are all the things that are kind of ancillary to the main part of the migration that you got to take in consideration of doing a huge program and getting that, pulled together. And the last thing I want to take away from this is really you got to, first crawl, then walk, then run, then full sprint, and always, continuous improvement over delayed perfection gets you to the end state you're looking for. That's it.
Great. Thanks, Gary. I'm glad we're in sprint now, so it works well. So Paul, can I hand over to you and see what you have to add?
Yes, you bet. So building on what Tony and Gary have said, my first piece of advice is you have to communicate early and often. If you think about your own inbox and how often you get a mail and skim it and then delete it and then find out later, oops, there was something in there that I missed when I was skimming it. And imagine what that's like for a user whose mailbox is going to be migrated from tenant A to tenant B at some point. You have to tell people what you're going to do. You have to tell them before you do it. You have to tell them when you're doing it. You have to tell them when it's done. And you almost can't over communicate. Now, there is a fine line between communicating and spamming, and that's going to vary by every organization. You're going to have to try to find that balance as best you can. Next, if you're trying to fly a curved course in an airplane, the mantra that they teach is twist 10 and turn 10. So you twist your navigation instrument 10 degrees, you fly that 10-degree section of the curve, and then you do that again. Same thing is true for migration. It's really important for you to, as quickly as you can, identify at least one and preferably several pilot groups you can work with during the migration to fine-tune your communication, to make sure that you understand all the impacts of all the things Gary talked about, identity, mail routing, you name it. Because what you don't want is you don't want to plan the entire migration and then start it and find, oops, something doesn't work, but have the migration already in progress with people expecting that it will complete during a particular time. So set a set of small goals, test them, verify that you hit those goals, and then set larger goals, progressively, repetitively. Next, can't overemphasize this enough. Gary can tell you stories about what their service desk call volume looked like on the day after each of his tenants got migrated. Because what's going to happen? Let's say that you have 99% migration quality. So 99% of the things that you're migrating migrate with no problem. If you have 10,000 users, that means on day one, you're going to have 100 users where something is broken. A good migration tool set, a good migration process will show you what those 100 things are, and maybe you can fix, 30 of them before those users get to work. So now you've got 70 users whose stuff is broken. And you have, I don't even want to guess, some larger number of users who didn't read the email or weren't paying attention or were on leave or for whatever reason, don't understand why their stuff suddenly doesn't work. So be prepared to surge extra capacity to your service desk and to give your service desk team extra training, extra support, extra people, pizza, whatever it's going to take to make sure that they are staffed and ready to handle that initial wave of requests for help. Next, metrics. How do you know what good looks like in a migration? Well, that's really going to be up to your environment and up to your plan, because depending on how much data you're migrating, what types of data you're migrating, how many people you're migrating, et cetera, you'll have to try to come up with some realistic targets for how will I know if the migration is successful? So maybe you say, okay, if 99% of my users have their data completely migrated, plus or minus, say, 3 working days of their original migration target, I consider that successful. You won't know if you're doing a good job during your early pilots unless you have some sort of metrics to tell you whether things are successful. And it's not good enough just to say, I want to migrate everything and have it be perfect. Because of course that's what you want, but you can't measure that on a scale that has either 0 or 100 with nothing in between. Okay, know where the seams are. This is really important because there are workloads that cannot effectively be migrated, but there are also business processes or things that your employees do that are susceptible to interruption. So know where those things are, right? As an example, is the oldest piece of advice in the migration world. If you have a company that does something big at the end of a quarter or the end of a year, don't migrate people then. If you are a retailer, for example, you're probably not going to want to migrate now as we roll up to the retail season for holiday shopping. If you are a healthcare company, especially something like an insurance provider, since October is typically when open employee enrollment starts, you probably don't want to schedule migrations then. So know what the interface between your technical processes and your business requirements look like to make sure that you're not accidentally doing something in the migration side that will break or rip open that seam on the business side. Then last, and this may be unpopular advice, but it's still important, have a backup plan. Be prepared, whether that is through having a SWAT team of migration engineers, whether that's having a way to cut back over, whether that's not removing source accounts until after you verify that the target accounts are up, but have a plan to recover from anything bad that may happen during your migration. You can't not have that, because as Mike can tell you, there are many, many, many things that can happen during a migration that you might not expect up front. Until you have done a bunch of migrations, you really haven't seen all the bad things that could potentially happen. I'll give you an example. We were doing a migration of one of Gary's tenants. And normally one of the steps that has to take place is that Microsoft has to eject the domain so that you can rehome it. And that didn't happen. We waited and waited and waited, and the domain wasn't ejected. And we waited and waited and waited some more, and it still wasn't ejected. Microsoft had a long delay. Luckily, we had planned for the case where, okay, if we have a domain ejection delay, then here's what we're going to do in response. That's it's an example of how you have to be prepared in advance if something happens to interrupt your timeline or interrupt your flow. So good luck.
Good luck. Hopefully we can give some luck today. All right, and I'll round it out with just some of the advice that I have from the projects that we have done. And my first piece of advice is focus your time. And by this, I don't mean when I say you can't do everything. Obviously, you need to account for as much as you possibly can, but you can't put a lot of focus on every single aspect. So very early, and a lot of what I really focus on in our projects is collecting data so that you understand what's being used and what to focus on. And when I talk about that, I really want to know what is enabled across the board. So what is actually there? what are the data volumes, and that's important because that will tell me how long we need to sync for. What could be a problem for a weekend migration? Maybe I need to do a staged migration for an aspect of it, or just any other major issues. But the most important thing is activity. So if you have something that doesn't have a lot of data volume, but has a lot of activity, then I really need to focus on that user experience to ensure that we can handle the first few days in the new tenancies. We may want to do extra testing. There may be a really important application with a lot of activity that impacts the revenue for this company that's been acquired. Whatever it may be, you really want to focus your time on these items and focus less on the items that you can handle through communications. A great example of this is, let's say there's a tenant that had Yammer enabled for everybody on a tenancy. Some organizations would see that it's enabled for everybody and focus on, okay, we've got to figure out how we're going to handle this problem because there are some limitations in that API. We then dive into it and we find, okay, there was a decent amount of volume, but it really isn't used very much. Oh, there's only 50 users out of 3,000 using it. Maybe we can do a custom email that just informs people that are currently on Yammer that they're going to have to recreate on the other side, whatever it may be. But you can simplify your project and then move on to the things that really need your focus and advice, like identity management, like the domain aspect, and SharePoint applications, and these other things that really, more people will be impacted by or may impact your revenue. So really, very early, you want to make data-driven decisions and collect as much data as possible about the source tenant and the configuration of the source tenant so you can be ready for that migration and have a successful project. So with that, we're going to start going through the questions that were pre-submitted. If you have additional questions, do please still put them in the question bar. We will answer them offline likely because I think these are going to take up some time, but we'll ensure that they're in the post blog. So with that, Stephen asks, and Gary, this will be your question to start off with, I am a nonprofit with 60,000 accounts and 85 tenants. Where do I begin? So only 85 tenants on this one, Gary. Where do we think Stephen should start trying to figure out how to handle this?
Yeah, I'd probably say I think you hit the nail on the head, Mike, in your last comment, and that's really the data discovery and understanding what you have out there, right? That's how we started this initial project of the 137 tenants to one. It was really going out there and doing that deep discovery of, okay, what is your total data size? What tenants do you have? Validating your tenancies, validating the types of services within those tenancies, right? Be it, what workflows are enabled. Really understanding the complexity of what are integrated. We found things like all these third-party software that had rationalized as a part of the consolidation, right? So I'll probably say the first place you really want to start off is doing a deep dive discovery of your 85 tenants, really understanding the makeup. And then once you have that, right, is really start to define those into what I call kind of the t-shirt side model, complexity level and prioritization. And that becomes even more critical, right? Because understanding kind of the, what I call the small, the medium, the large helps you build the schedule. But although you might have a small tenancy, the complexity level might be very high based on what's enabled and what's integrated with it, right? So that allows you to kind of, one, understand what you're dealing with, understand the impacts across the 85 tenancies, allow you to build that kind of pipeline you're looking for. It also allows you to start building your factory, your testing model, regression activities, and kind of ultimately your migration process. And we start defining, what, and I think Tony said this earlier, test, but what can be automated to a tool set and what really can be, and will only be manual in terms of, getting that migrate into the tenancy and defining all the strategy behind that. So I'll probably say where you really want to start, and it's super critical, is really having the right process to really discover and understand what's in those tenancies and what the impact will be to your migration strategy and migration process.
And I agree. I think that makes a lot of sense. The other thing that you may want to look at is, does this data need to migrate? And you may find that some of these tenancies may not have certain data restrictions. Obviously nonprofit, it's a wide variety. So that could, be a nonprofit for a healthcare organization and that data is highly protected. Or it might be a nonprofit where you may have a lot of volunteer accounts or things like that that may not need to migrate that data. So I think my other suggestion there is looking at activity with the data that Gary suggests as well, because you may find that you can simplify this project a little bit. You know, maybe you power the user up in the target and they self-migrate a couple of the OneDrive documents. You obviously don't want to do that in mass, but you may find that you don't have as large of a project depending on the nature of your business.
Agreed, Mike.
Great. All right, our next question is for Paul and Gary. So Jason asks, how do you handle the aspect of agreeing on a final configuration when you're combining tenants? Paul, do you want to start us off?
I like the Thunderdome approach, where you lock everybody in a room and nobody comes out until you've settled. No, seriously, this is a complicated problem because in many cases, when you're doing a tenant to tenant, you're doing it because of an organizational change. So there's been a merger, there's been an acquisition, maybe there's a divestiture or a change of control. And so 100% of the time in those situations, you're going to have a case where company A has a policy for, I don't know, how they name conference rooms or what standards are used to name groups or teams. And company B has a different policy. The reason they have those policies is because somebody at that organization cared enough to put a policy into place. And so I wish I could say there was a great technical solution for rationalizing these, but it really comes down to, at bottom, a business negotiation. Gary, I'd really like to hear more about how you handled that, because I know you did that pretty much every day for a long while.
Yeah, Paul, I think you're totally spot on. I mean, for us, taking 137 tenants with varying standards, what we did is not so much Thunderdome, but we kind of took that same approach to bring everybody in, right? So we had kind of a workshop and really understanding and bringing the what I call the leads of the major departments, what we call networks, and creating a governance body. And to your point, Paul, absolutely spot on, right? Everyone had varying naming conventions for distribution groups and mailboxes and room items, right? And it was really the body coming together and defining what those conventions were, looking at things like retention policies that vary from country to country, understanding what would be the overall arching retention policy that we need, right? So for us, I think the critical piece was, getting everyone, all stakeholders at the table. Sometimes the conversation is not easy, they're tough. And agreeing upon a set of standards. Okay, fine. Even in a merger and acquisition, in a real sense, 135 mergers and acquisitions we're doing here, coming up with a final list of what those standards are at the table, agreeing up on it, and setting those standards forward as what they look like in the new tenancy, right? So that's kind of how our approach was. It's really more of a organizational alignment to where the business wanted to go, and making sure that every one of the stakeholders at the table had agreement, and coming up with a set of standard that makes sense for the business and move forward.
Great. Thanks, Gary. Thanks, Paul. So this question's for Tony and for Gary. So Mary asks, and Gary, you probably have, you can chuckle on this one. How many hours of project management time do these projects take? It seems like so much is non-standard, but why don't we go ahead and start with you, Tony?
As long as a piece of string. I mean, the thing is you probably have as many project management hours in a project like this that you have in the lead technologists, because there's so much stuff to be coordinated across the various pillars like HR, legal, the business. And if somebody, the technologists aren't great about documenting things and making sure the stuff gets done. Let's face it, there are more interesting things in life than filling out lists. The PMs are extraordinarily wonderful at doing this one thing. So I would say, get the best PM you can. This tenant-to-tenant migration is not something for a novice PM to cut their teeth on. They need to understand, most importantly, how the organization really runs, not just the formal lines of communications, not just the lines of command and the organizational structure, but how to get things done inside the organization. And that typically means somebody who's experienced, who knows the organization backwards, has worked with many departments on different projects. They'll be totally valuable, totally invaluable for your project. But just expect to spend a lot of hours. Again, just how much? Depends how many tenants you got. Depends how many users you've got to move around. Depends on how many apps you're dealing with. Depends on the complexity of your business. Depends on how quickly you want this to get done. It depends on how many third-party apps you've got. Depends on what kind of federated setups you've got with other companies. There's a complete shopping list. It's just going to be a lot of effort.
And Gary, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I mean, I totally concur with Tony. I mean, for us, doing kind of the project management is a full-time job. A lot of people underestimate the role of a project manager in this kind of transformation, these type of projects. But to concur with what Tony said earlier, it depends on two things, right? It depends on the culture and the complexity of the organization. The more complex the organization is and depend on the culture, you're going to need more time, project management time. In some cases, you can run into situations where project management in some aspects are pretty straightforward and easy, and in aspects it takes a huge amount of effort to get the wheels moving to get something completed, especially with the complexity of the tenancies, the complexity of moving parts, data sovereignty, legal hold. Coordinating all of the various HR functions to get that completed takes a monumental amount of time. So what I've seen in my travels, a lot of people do underestimate what it takes for project management, but your project management, I could tell you from my experience, will make or break your environment. If you have an amazing project management team who can do all the coordination and keep you on task, you will be successful. If you have a poor project management team, you will have troubles with your tenant consolidation.
Great.
And just to answer this, just to add to this, Mike, one thing I think people see project management sometimes as a huge overhead cost. In this case, I think if you have the right project managers in place and they have all those attributes that we've just discussed, they will save the company money because they will simply make sure that things get done on time and at a quality level.
Absolutely, and avoid decision paralysis as well, which I think is an interesting issue with projects like this as well. At some point, you have to move. Thank you. So Paul and Tony, we've gotten a lot of questions that came in, so I themed them together into this one. But where should I draw the line and just migrate things manually? I only have 30 users. So Paul, could you kick us off on that?
So that's kind of ties back to Tony's comment a minute ago about how long is a piece of string. Because if you only have 30 users, if you were only migrating mailboxes, you could make a pretty good argument that there are worse ways to migrate than to do it manually. But then if you say, well, I have 30 users and they have OneDrive and they have email, or I have 30 users and we also have 70 teams because we create one team per project or one team per product, pretty quickly you see the number of users you have is only one of the factors that you should use when you're deciding what your strategy for moving your data is going to be, because you can have a relatively small number of users that still leads you to have a complicated environment or a lot of data that might mean that it's not feasible to move things manually in the amount of time you have. You always can trade time. If you're willing to allow things to take longer, then that gives you flexibility that you wouldn't have otherwise. But most of us don't have that luxury. When we're migrating, we have a particular schedule we're trying to meet to avoid business milestones. So the end of the quarter, the start of the new school year, planned maintenance on a building or a facility or so on. So Tony, I don't know what you think. I know you like doing a lot of hand jamming with PowerShell. Would you, for 30 users, automatically just default to doing it manually?
No, never. I come back to the thing I said earlier on, that there's the interconnection between apps within Office 365 that makes it difficult. So sure, if you're only going to do a few mailboxes, go for it. Have a happy time. But if you're in any type of complexities, you're going to have some difficulties. I mean, if we look at some apps that don't have migration APIs, like Planner, how are you going to handle those, even for 30 users? That's right now, you're going to have to be writing some code. If you're dealing with things like sensitivity labels, encryption, and you've got all of a sudden you've got the fact that, yeah, you might only have 30 users, but all those users are sending each other protected documents, protected messages. What's going to happen when you get across to the new tenant and you suddenly find out, oh, we can't get access to any of those documents anymore because the keys used to decrypt the content no longer correspond to the folks' UPNs. So in the old days, moving 30 mailboxes between two on-prem applications, moving 30,000 documents between two SharePoint organizations, sure, no problem. Over the weekend, get it done. In the cloud, there, as I said, I keep on saying, so many interconnections, so many different ways of dealing with, interacting with data. Just think about it first before you decide to plunge in and do stuff over a weekend, because I think you're going to find that there's a lot of complexity there that you might not have anticipated.
There's almost no feeling worse than getting toward the end of your migration window on a weekend and thinking, oh my goodness, I still have all this other stuff yet to do. And I only have 12 hours, 9 hours, 4 hours before people come back to work and it's not done. Don't put yourself in that position if you don't have to.
Yeah, I think another thing too that we have to reflect on is that users have a huge amount of data now inside Office 365. When you think about it, when Exchange 4.0 was launched in 1996, like half a century ago, wherever, 10 meg, 20 meg mailboxes were the norm. Now users with E5 and E3 licenses get 100 gigs straight off the bat. And they have all the recoverable items, that's another 100 gig. And they have these expandable archives, which are, can be up to a terabyte. And then you have all the data that's stored in SharePoint and all this data that's stored in OneDrive, and people keep on expanding their OneDrive allocation from a standard 5 gig upwards. So, the question has to be asked, yeah, you might only have 30 users, but if they've all got these mega mailboxes with expanding archives, and they've got these huge documents and whatever, and they are in a habit of storing movie files, I guess, or something like that in their OneDrive, will you be even able to do it over the weekend, given the amount of data that you might have to process?
Great advice. And actually, on a similar thing, the next question is, how do I migrate Microsoft Teams?
Why would you want to do such a thing? Oh, sorry.
Because we're all home and have been using it forever now.
Yeah, well, of course, yesterday we learned from Microsoft's results, or Wednesday, no, it's Tuesday. Tuesday, we learned from Microsoft results that there are now 115 million Teams users out there, which roughly speaking, I think accounts for about half of all the Office 365 active user accounts. So Teams is becoming an increasing factor for many organizations. And to be fair, inside those organizations, Teams has been used as a glue to knit together access to things like Microsoft Lists, SharePoint, Planner, To-Do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, all the custom apps. And I think the last time I looked at it, in the App Store, there were about 790 apps that can be deployed through Teams. So, this is now a big thing to deal with. The problem that we've got is, of course, that there are no APIs to deal with it. Microsoft right now is focusing, as far as I can see, all its efforts in migrating the last few Slack users on the face of the planet Teams to join the Happy Bunch. And they're not really concentrating so much in dealing with this particular aspect, which ISPs in this horrible place where you have to mix and match and use whatever APIs and functionality is available to move stuff around. You'll be able to read stuff out of Teams pretty well okay, whether or not you're able to get stuff over to Teams in the remote tenant in a state where they're usable. That's a completely different matter. So it's just a huge challenge right now. It's a huge challenge.
It's worse than that, because not only is it a challenge, as Tony said, Microsoft hasn't produced the full set of APIs that we need to migrate stuff. But you also run into the problem of what does it mean to migrate teams anyway? Right? I mean, if you think about what can exist in a team, even if Microsoft gave us perfect APIs to move all of the message content and all of the file content, which they have not yet done, all sorts of other things that can be in teams. Right? You can have tabs, you can have notebooks, you can have applications. And the bigger problem, the problem that's going to continue after Microsoft gives us those APIs is one of knowing what you have before the migration so that you can make sure that everything either gets migrated or that you know it's not going to be migrated. Tony's mention of planner is a really good example. If I have a plan attached as a tab in a team, it can't be migrated. And so I need to know that as part of my migration planning. I need to know that that plan is there because since it's not going to be migrated, if it's important, I have to come up with some contingency way to get that data into the new tenant. And so, you know, Microsoft likes to talk about the combination of people and processes and technology. They have a lot of work to do on the technology side, but as migrators, it doesn't take away our responsibility on the process side to make sure we know what's in the teams we're thinking about migrating.
Right, and just to add another little piece of gasoline to this particular fire, we're dealing with a shifting horizon here. A great example of this is the fact that Teams uses Stream as its repository for meeting recordings, which is all great. I mean, and right now we're going through a shift to say, well, we're not going to use the Stream storage on Azure, and instead everybody's going to store the recordings in either SharePoint or OneDrive for Business, which seems like a good idea. But there are other things that you have to think about, like, for example, how do you get any of the old recordings out of Stream? Because again, there isn't an API for that purpose. Now, even if you can get the videos out, can you get other stuff out, like the transcripts, the captions? On the other hand, teams say that they are moving towards a different transcript model where the transcript will become just one of the resources that are available for a meeting. So you'll be able to have your meeting, you turn transcription on as part of recording. The transcript is generated and it's added to the meeting. Will you then be able to move the transcript, the meeting chat, the meeting notes, the whiteboard links, etc., all of which constitute the full manifest of the meeting? And I don't think anybody can give a good answer now, because firstly, it is a shift in platform as Microsoft moves away from Stream storage to SharePoint and OneDrive, but they're also at the same time introducing new functionality, and there aren't APIs to get at this kind of stuff. So Teams is just a very difficult situation for people right now. And there are folks out there who will tell you that, oh, it's simple, we'll just move around the compliance records that are stored in Exchange Online that are generated for e-discovery purposes. And you know, yeah, that's an okay thing if you're happy to have raw data moved. It's not an okay thing if you want, firstly, totally accurate data because there's some stuff missing in it, but secondly, if you want usable data, because you're not going to be able to use that data in the future. So this is just a sucky area to deal with right now.
So we'll try to move on to a less sucky area right now. So Chris asks, is it possible to transition a domain with mailboxes between tenants without mailflow disruption?
Well, you go for this one, Mike. I'll concentrate on being less sucky.
Okay, fair enough. So the short answer is there is a preview program that was announced at Ignite this year where there is going to be allowing you to share this, to share the SMTP domain, which people with Exchange experience will find the experience somewhat familiar. I see the note here though on mailflow disruption, and there is a practice that some administrators use to pause mailflow. And the first thing to ask is, do you have a mail processor in front of Exchange Online protection? So doing message spam or whatever it may be. If you do, you can actually usually pause that mailflow, do the domain ejection move, and then reopen on the other side. there's a practice that some administrators use that you have to be very, very careful about, which is where you literally take your MX record and you put it to a known a address that you own, but it makes it look like the mail server's down, and then the server that is sending the messages will start queuing that mail, and then you've got to fix it within so many hours, and then once the domain is moved, you can actually correct the record and the mail will come back over. You've got to be very careful doing that, but there are a lot of administrators that use that to not have any mail loss during the domain migration.
I guess you just proved my point that you need to test everything before you make a final commit.
Absolutely, because if you do it wrong, you won't get the intended results, or worse, you will send your mail somewhere you don't want it to go.
Yeah. Just a point about the what Microsoft has announced at Ignite, which is just tenant-to-tenant mailbox migration. Essentially, what they're doing here is taking the well-used and well-worn mailbox replication service. It's been around since Exchange in 2010. It's used for onboarding of messages from on-prem to Exchange Online. But basically, what they've done is just given administrators the ability to knit together tenants so that you give MRS, the Mailbox Replication Service, the ability to select mailboxes in your tenant or another tenant as targets. It all sounds good. It's using basic Microsoft technology. The movements happens inside their cloud, which is also a good thing. The downside is that it's MRS. MRS is, you know, at times it doesn't have great logging, for example. There's a habit of dropping messages that are bad items and so forth. So you just got to keep an eye on it. But hey, it's cheap, it's cheerful, and it's not so sucky.
Great. So Gary, this is for you and I. Can a tool just be run to analyze the source and target environment and then build what to process? Or I think what to move is what the author's getting at here.
I'll probably say, Mike, the answer is no. There is no magical panacea tool out there that will just run against your environment and allow you to migrate. I think a lot of that will give you just the base components of a tenancy. You know, mailbox sizes, what's in the tenancy itself. I think the critical part here, and I think what people are missing, is nothing beats the detailed discovery interview that we'll need to have with either the tenant owners to really understand what the ancillary things that are tied to the tenancy, right? The things like MDF systems are tied to it, third-party application integration, what identity systems you have, how do you provision users into your tenancy. There's a whole ecosystem of things that, you know, no tool will ever pick up within an environment. So I think it's going to be a combination, right? It's a combination of tools to give you some base of what's in a tenancy, but, you know, it's going to take a lot of what I call the question and answer process and the deep dive discovery to really understand all the components of the tenancy to really build a successful process of how you migrate that. And again, some of those processes can be migrated easily in terms of, you know, some kind of automation tool, but, you know, as Tony said earlier, and I think toward the thread of the conversation, a lot of these components within Microsoft, such as Teams, Power BI, and some of the newer workloads, there are no APIs to get them migrated across. So it's going to take some manual processes and some homegrown things to get those migrated to the target. Mike, over to you. You want to add on to that?
Yeah, and I think you know, you said there's no magic tool here, and certainly, you know, we have a part of our reporting and analytics arm is a reporting tool, and we use this to kind of help scope and start the story, but every tenant is unique. So I know I have a process that I use to, you know, scope everything at a very high level, and then immediately it just generates more questions, but that's really part of the process. So where tooling can help is it can help you with that discovery process, and you're not writing 50 scripts and modifying it and keeping up to date. But, you know, you do need to also have, you know, org knowledge and understand what people are using and to an extent to be ready for it. So I think a tool is just, it's a tool, right? But it's not going to be the only thing or just some magic to take care of all of it for you.
Yeah, agreed, Mike. I can give you an example of, you know, where that, what I call detailed discovery comes into play. So an example, one of our tenant consolidations, we did the discovery and thought, oh, wow, this is going to be a standard AD connecting ADFS connection coming in. And in the, the assumption in the deep dive, we found out, well, it wasn't ADFS. It was really a third-party identity management tool pretending to be ADFS that didn't have a lot of the functionality needed to do kind of the domain injection and cut over. So we had to actually retool the entire identity component to get us ready for tenant consolidation, right? So when I mean by that last mile discovery, a tool might give you some components, you make an assumption, but again, that follow-up deep dive questionnaire or deep dive session gives you kind of the last mile that can sometimes change how your tenant consolidation process is going to work.
Excellent. Thanks, Gary. Okay, and I think this is going to be the last one that we can actually cover before we go into closeout. So Steve asked, what suggestions do you have for the services that do not move, like Project Planner, Microsoft Lists, eDiscovery, and more? And that'll be for Paul and Tony.
I'm tempted to quote Dante's Inferno here and say something about abandoning all hope. But really, if you have data and you can't move it, then you have to decide how important it is and whether it is worth moving it manually or recreating it or keeping it in the old tenant or doing something else to keep it around. What I see far too many customers doing when they get ready to start their migration, they box up everything that they can in the old tenant and they move it wholesale to the new tenant without ever stopping to think about whether they need all that stuff or not. It's a crazy way to work, but it also, it's painful to go through your accumulated stockpiles of files on file servers and mail in shared mailboxes and public folders and decide whether you actually need to keep it or not, but you have to.
I guess just looking at this list, there's some things that are okay, I guess, in a different way. Planner, you can move with a little bit of graph processing. The difficulty with Planner is not the actual plans and tasks themselves. It's the case of there's a lot of manual activity that has to be done on the target tenant to allow you to actually write into the new plans. And then there's all the stuff surrounding Planner, like does it have any attachments and stuff like that, and also making sure that the group membership is lined up correctly for Planner. But the actual task data can be moved. Lists are part of SharePoint, so any competent SharePoint migration tool which deals with the full amounts of information, the full spectrum of information site, team site should be able to deal with that, including all the metadata. eDiscovery, well, eDiscovery is going to be specific to the tenant that you run it in. What strikes me here is that it's possible that you may have eDiscovery cases that are ongoing at the time when you want to do a tenant migration. And this is the nature of eDiscovery, especially if you're doing an investigation. There's something problematic, fraud, for example. It's the nature of those type of investigations that they last quite a long time. So you may be in a situation where you want to move some data but are prohibited from moving that data until the eDiscovery actually completes, or the investigators, the people that are overseeing the investigation, are happy that you have recovered all of the necessary information and saved it in such a way that that those actions, the saving actions, can be defended in court. But you know what? This is just comes back to, I think Gary's making a point about just ask, investigate, look and see what's happening, and not only inside Office 365 itself, but what is the business using this technology for? And the business should be able to tell you, hey, well, we've got a couple of problems here that we're working with the law department. You got to figure out then, do you need to accelerate the export of all the information and get it put into maybe some of these specialized systems that people use for pursuing investigations like that? Law firms are very fond of that kind of stuff. Or are you happy enough to leave it in place and move it to the new tenant and then continue any e-discovery activity there. And that's going to be a discussion with the business and with legal. And as for the all-in clause and more, yeah, there is going to be more. There's going to be more features added to Office 365 over the next while. We can't predict how that's going to work out. A good example of that is Project Maka, which is just announced and for commercial tenants a couple of weeks ago. That stuffs away all its information inside the Exchange Online mailboxes, but it puts it into the non-client accessible part of the mailbox, non-email client accessible part of the mailbox. So if you move a mailbox over, you're not going to move over the Project Maka stuff. Now, there's all that kind of stuff. We can't predict how things are going to change over the next while. It's just an ongoing challenge.
Great. Thanks, Tony. This question, I see the person who asked it is on. I will do a full follow-up on. The only theme that I will add to splitting on-prem into several is be very careful, because then you're going to deal potentially down the road with the tenant-to-tenant migration with the challenges that we have here. But for our closeout question, simple around the board here. When combining multiple tenants, do you start fresh or do you pick one to move to? This has been one that came in several questions of, do you move to the, whoever's more complex, or do you greenfield? And we'll try to all go around briefly and answer that. Gary, can we start with you?
Yeah, so I'll probably say this all depends on your business outcome, right? When we made the decision to do tenant consolidation, we had tenants that were already consolidated, but our decision was to go greenfield for a lot of business reasons. The effort to sometimes retrofit and standardize an existing incumbent tenancy can be difficult, and the other component of that, from a business perspective, it can also be highly political from nature, right? So in our case, based on the political aspects as well as some of the business needs and direction we're going in, we chose to go to a greenfield tenancy because it was much more easier for us than trying to retrofit an existing tenancy and dealing with some of the politics behind that. That's one. And then two, some of the effort to reassess and reevaluate and then retrofit the tenancy to meet the needs of the business going forward.
Great. Tony, your thoughts?
I don't think there's a good answer here. I really don't think there's a good answer because there's so many variables. And I think it depends on the countries that you operate in. You may not get to vote. You may be told that, this is the way it's happening. Because, for example, some people do this to make sure that they can move all their data into a go local data center. So you may just be forced to have a new tenant there, which is located in a go local data center like Switzerland, Norway, South Africa, or whatever. You're just going to have to understand your business. You understand the technology, understand the data you've got, and make the best call that you can make after understanding all of those factors.
Thank you. So, Paul, I think we're going to move to the last piece here because we are just running almost at the end of the hour here. If you do have more questions, though, please feel free to submit them in the question bar, and we will include them in the post-presentation questions. Brad, thanks for having us here. Do you want to close out where we are?
Yeah, Mike, thank you. I want to thank everybody who joined us as attending today, and for Mike for helping put all this together. If we didn't get to your questions today and you still have additional questions, Mike is going to be able to help divert those or potentially answer them himself, but we will make sure that you do get an answer. And with that, we really appreciate your time, all of the speakers and the attendees, and we are especially grateful to Gary Bent and Tony Redmond from sharing their outside experience today. Those are the industry experts, and they brought a lot to the table, and you can find more information here. And the last question that we have that is always, if you want to watch this session again, because there's a lot of good information, give us a couple days, but you'll be able to find that information at petri.com/webinars, and we'll make sure to share all those links out. And you can find Mike's contact on the display there, and we will catch all of you right back here on the next webinar. Thanks for attending.